22 feet. Not inches, not a few steps up a curb. 22 feet, the height of a two-story building. That is the measurement the Seattle City Council voted to impose on an entire downtown core in the summer of 1889. I had encountered that number before in a brochure, I think, for one of the underground tour in Pioneer Square. I noted it the way you note a curiosity, filed it, moved on. I didn't question it for years. Then I went back to Pioneer Square and I stood still for a moment on the sidewalk outside a building on First Avenue, and I looked down. Beneath my boots, set flush into the concrete, were small panels of thick, frosted glass, purple-tinted from decades of oxidation. I had walked over them dozens of times, but standing still, I began to understand what they were. They weren't decorative. They were skylights. I was standing on a ceiling. Somewhere below the street I was walking on, there was another street. The original street, the one people actually built their lives on. The official account of what happened here is not wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete in ways that I find difficult to dismiss. The story goes like this. A fire destroyed Seattle's downtown in a single afternoon in June of 1889, and the city, faced with the wreckage, seized the moment to finally solve its drainage problem by raising the streets. Heroic engineering, necessary progress, a city reborn from ash. That is the version that appears in the histories, in the tour scripts, in the civic mythology. What the official account tends not to linger on is what happened to the people who were already there, the ones who had already rebuilt, the ones who couldn't wait or couldn't afford to wait and went up at the old grade, and then watched the city raise the road around them until their front doors opened onto a wall of earth. Their ground floors became basements. Their storefronts became something else entirely. Hold that, I want to come back to it. Because the part of this story I couldn't resolve, the part that kept pulling me back into the archive, was not the engineering, it was the timeline. The underground wasn't sealed until 1907, 18 years. For nearly 2 decades, a functioning city existed beneath the new streets. Commerce, residency, things the city officially did not sanction and quietly did not stop. And then, in 1907, it was bricked up, in a single public health order, gone. I want to understand why it took 18 years. And I want to understand why, when the city finally acted, it chose burial over excavation. To understand why the fire mattered so much, you have to understand what Seattle smelled like before it. The original town site was built on a tidal flat, not near a tidal flat. On one, the ground beneath the earliest structures sat barely above sea level, which meant that twice a day, when the tide came in from Elliott Bay, the city's drainage system reversed direction. The pipes that were meant to carry waste away from the city instead carried the bay back into it. Raw sewage backed into basements, into wells, into the water supply. By the mid-1880s, Seattle had recorded typhoid outbreaks that city health reports described, with some restraint, as a matter of serious concern. Visitors used less restrained language. The smell, according to accounts from that period, was not merely unpleasant. It was a presence, something you moved through. The engineering solution was not a secret. City surveyors had been arguing for regrades since at least 1876. Shave the hills to the east, use the spoil to raise the tidal flats, create a grade that would let water move away from the city rather than into it. The math was not complicated. The problem was the money, and more precisely, the problem was whose money. Property owners on the flats resisted assessments. Property owners on the hills resisted the excavation. The city council could not agree on who would bear the cost of a project that would benefit everyone in aggregate and ruin several people specifically, so nothing moved. The city kept growing, kept flooding, and kept producing the kind of public health record that should have forced action. It didn't. I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting the fire was anything other than what the record says it was, an accident, a pot of glue, a dry summer afternoon. What I am suggesting is that the fire solved, in a single afternoon, a political problem that 13 years of documented suffering had failed to solve. The infrastructure argument had been made. The health argument had been made. The smell argument had been made. None of it was sufficient. And then the buildings were gone, and suddenly it was sufficient. That asymmetry is worth holding on to. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The mainstream narrative often ignores the smell of history until it's too late to ask who profited. Now, back to Seattle in 1889, because the fire is only the beginning of what I cannot explain. The city announced the regrade, and then the property owners had to make a decision. The decision the city announced was straightforward enough on paper. The streets would be raised, new grades would be set, property owners should plan accordingly. What the announcement did not specify with any precision was when, and that ambiguity, whether it was accidental or deliberate, I cannot say, created a set of conditions that I think deserve more scrutiny than they have received. Some owners waited. They held their burned lots, paid assessments, and watched for the city to act. Others could not wait or would not. They needed income. They had debts tied to the property. They rebuilt immediately at the old grade on the reasonable assumption that the city's regrade plan was aspirational at best and that the practical reality of raising 22 feet of downtown would be negotiated down, delayed indefinitely, or simply abandoned. That was not an irrational bet. Cities make ambitious announcements after disasters. Most of those announcements do not survive contact with budget reality. This one did. Let me say that plainly. The city raised the streets, not in every block simultaneously, not without years of grinding, chaotic, piecemeal construction, but it happened. And when it did, the owners who had rebuilt at the old grade found themselves in a situation that has no flattering description. Their buildings were structurally sound. Their businesses were operational. And their front entrances were now below the road, accessible only by ladder, then later by wooden staircases cut into the retaining walls that the city erected at the sidewalk's edge. Those retaining walls, I keep returning to them. They were presented as a practical necessity, a way to hold the new grade while the fill settled, and they were that. But they were also, in effect, a physical ledger of who had capital and who did not. The owners who could afford to wait had rebuilt at the new grade. Their doors opened onto the street. The owners who could not afford to wait had their doors in a hole. The wall didn't cause that difference, but it made it permanent and visible and literal. What I want to understand is what happened inside those holes, because for nearly 2 decades, people kept using them. Standard account of the underground economy is not difficult to find. Tour guides will tell you about it. It appears in popular histories. The story goes that once the streets were raised and certain businesses found themselves below grade, the underground corridors became convenient for activities the city preferred not to officially acknowledge: gambling, opium, prostitution, and that this was tolerated in the loose, frontier pragmatic way that many Western cities tolerated such things in the 1890s. Vice existed, everyone knew, no one looked too hard. That explanation is not wrong. But I want to slow down at the word tolerated, because I think it is doing significant work in that sentence. The Seattle Police Department conducted raids on underground establishments throughout the 1890s. This is documented. What is also documented in the same records is the pattern of those raids, who they targeted when they arrived, and perhaps more instructively, when they did not. Establishments with documented connections to city aldermen and prominent property holders appear in the raid records with a frequency that suggests, at minimum, selective attention. The timing of certain raids correlates, in ways I cannot fully explain, with moments when a particular underground tenant had become inconvenient to someone above street level. Let me say that again more carefully. I am not claiming the police were uniformly corrupt or that every raid was politically motivated. What the pattern appears to suggest is something more specific, that the underground was not merely tolerated but managed, that someone, or some set of someones, understood its economic value and made regular calculations about when to look away and when to act. A parallel economy operating beneath a city for nearly 20 years with the knowledge of the authorities above it. That is not neglect. That begins to look like an arrangement. Remember that framing, because in 1907 the arrangement ended, and the reason given was a plague. Bubonic plague is not a subtle threat. It is not something a city government invokes lightly or ought to. The 1907 condemnation order cited the underground spaces beneath Pioneer Square as a vector for disease, dark, damp, poorly ventilated, the kind of environment where rats move freely and contagion compounds. That is a legitimate public health concern. I want to be clear about that. The plague had reached the American West Coast by the early 1900s. San Francisco had a documented outbreak beginning in 1900. The fear was not fabricated from nothing. What I cannot reconcile is the scope of the response relative to the documented evidence of actual risk, in Seattle specifically. The 1907 order did not quarantine a block. It did not mandate inspections, improvements, or remediation. It ordered the underground sealed, bricked up, the entrances closed, the corridors closed, the spaces rendered permanently inaccessible, not cleaned, not assessed structure by structure, sealed. The word appears repeatedly in the municipal record, and I think it deserves more attention than it has received, because sealing is a permanent action. You seal something when you have decided it should not be opened again. Let me say that more slowly. The city had tolerated these spaces for 18 years, through documented vice, through selective raids, through an arrangement that appears to have benefited people with names that appear elsewhere in the property records. And then, in a single order, justified by a plague threat that the Seattle records do not show manifesting in the underground specifically, the entire physical history of the regrade was made inaccessible. The retaining walls, the stranded storefronts, the evidence of who had been pushed below grade and why all of it behind brick. The timing is what I cannot explain away. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This series goes into the bricked-up archives most channels won't touch. Now, back to 1907, because the condemnation order is only half of what happened that year. The other half involves a man named Bill Spadel, and he doesn't arrive for another 50 years. But what he found when he started pulling at the record suggests that someone, in 1907, understood exactly what they were sealing inside. Bill Spadel was not an academic. I want to establish that clearly because it matters for how you weigh what he found. He was a journalist, a promoter, a man with a gift for the readable sentence and a commercial interest in what lay beneath Pioneer Square. In 1965, he began leading tourists through the underground corridors he had helped persuade the city to partially reopen, and in 1966, he published a book called Sons of the Prophets, a title that was not subtle about its thesis. His argument, assembled from city records, property ledgers, and the kind of archival patience that journalists occasionally summon, was that Seattle's founding generation, Denny, Yesler, the names on the street signs, had not built a city so much as extracted one. That the regrades, the fires, the public health orders were instruments of accumulation, not civic improvement. The historical establishment did not receive this warmly, and I think some of that skepticism was deserved. Spadel wrote with more confidence than the record always supports. He assigned motive where the evidence shows only outcome. But here is what I cannot dismiss. The property records he cited are real. The names that appear in the regrade assessment disputes are the same names that appear in the post-regrade land valuations. The people who controlled the timing of the street raises were, in several documented cases, the same people who held adjacent lots at the new grade. I am not saying that is proof of coordination. I am saying that Spadel was asking the right question 50 years before anyone else thought to ask it publicly. What he could not answer, what no one has fully answered, is what remains sealed in the blocks he never reached. The tour covers roughly one city block. That is the part of the underground that has been assessed, stabilized, partially lit, and deemed safe for public passage. One block, in a downtown core that originally spanned dozens. The rest remains as the 1907 order left it, sealed, unmapped in any comprehensive modern survey, accessible in places only through private property, whose owners have neither the incentive nor the obligation to investigate what lies beneath their foundations. I want to be precise about what unmapped means here. Because it is easy to romanticize, I am not suggesting there are dramatic vaults of preserved commerce waiting untouched beneath every sidewalk. Sections have collapsed, Water intrusion over a century does significant work. What I am suggesting is that the decision not to excavate, not to conduct a systematic archaeological survey of the sealed blocks before further development altered them permanently, was itself a decision. It was not the default, it was a choice. Cities excavate. When London builds a railway, archaeologists move in front of the machines. When Rome digs a foundation, the law requires a survey. Seattle has expanded its underground infrastructure repeatedly since 1907, including a significant transit project in the 1990s, and the archaeological record from those excavations is not comprehensive. Some of it is not public. That absence of record is itself a kind of evidence, not proof, evidence. What strikes me most, looking at this from the distance of the full investigation, is the consistency of the pattern, the inability to fund the regrade, the convenient fire, the ambiguous announcement, the retaining walls, the managed economy, the plague order, the sealed blocks, the incomplete survey. Each decision, taken alone, is explainable. Together, they describe something. And Seattle is not the only city built on a raised grade. Here is what this investigation has shown me, stated as plainly as I can manage. A city had a drainage problem it could not politically solve. A fire solved it. The solution was announced without a timeline. The ambiguity of that timeline sorted property owners by capital. The sorting was made permanent by retaining walls. The spaces below those walls were occupied for 18 years in a manner the city's own records suggest was managed, not merely tolerated. And then, in a single public health order, whose proportionality I cannot reconcile with the documented risk, everything below the new grade was sealed behind brick. For 50 years, no one asked too loudly why. When someone finally did, the physical record was already incomplete in ways that made the full accounting impossible. That is the pattern, a political problem, a crisis, a solution whose costs fell asymmetrically on people without capital, an economy of silence, a permanent ceiling, an incomplete record. I do not have a verdict. I want to be honest about that. I have a pattern and a question I cannot resolve. At what point does a series of individually defensible decisions become, in aggregate, a policy? At what point does urban progress become the administrative burial of those who could not afford to rise with the grade? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that once you see those purple-tinted glass tiles for what they are, not sidewalk decoration, not a quirk of Northwest architecture, but the skylights of a city that was buried by a council vote, you cannot unknow it. A fire that solved a political impossibility overnight. A timeline left deliberately vague, retaining walls as a ledger of wealth. Raids that arrived when they were convenient. A plague order that sealed rather than remediated. A survey that was never completed. If you have theories about where the pattern leads next, I'd ask you to leave them below. The comments on this series have become part of the investigation, and I mean that. The next video goes into the urban renewal records of the 1960s. A different city, a different mechanism, the same asymmetry. It is a place I wasn't sure I was ready to go. I think I am now. See you there. I started this investigation standing on a sidewalk, looking down through frosted glass at a street that was buried alive. I'm still standing there.